This is Tony Diaz, a Librotraficante, and you're tuning into a multi-platform broadcast in tribute to the late Dr. Cintli, also known as Roberto Rodríguez, a dear friend of so many of us. And we're joining our entire community in luto, mourning his passing, but celebrating his legacy of work and conveying our condolences to the whole familia. So we wanted to make sure that this was going to be a broadcast for our radio show. So we will broadcast this on 90.1 FM KPFT, Houston's community station, on free radio, because Roberto was all about reaching the people with his wisdom, his wit, his intelligence, and we want to keep that going. I do want to say, on behalf of Nuestra Palabra, Latino writers having their say, and the Latino Bookstore and the Librotraficantes, we give our condolences to his familia that knew him through blood, through his whole life, to his familia that met him in the course of his work. And I personally, I'm so blessed to have been able to have known him, worked with him. We hosted him several times. He's part of the life of Nuestra Palabra, Latino writers having their say. He was one of the first nationally published authors that Nuestra Palabra hosted back when we convened in the party hall of Chapultepec Restaurant. And I have to smile when I say that because it's a beautiful memory. Shout out to Russell Contreras, who I believe was in college at the time. And he was excited about bringing Dr. Cintli to our event. I remember Tacho Mendiola was the director of Center for Mexican Studies at the University of Houston, and he brought maps showing us where Aztlan was believed to be versus where others had said it was, and always rejuvenating our history, our culture, always making us proud to be Chicanos, Chicanas. And I do want to get to our guest, but I do want to mention that we're happy to join this legacy where he returned to Houston to be part of the Latino Book and Family Festival. We also had the pleasure of interviewing him on our radio shows and broadcasts. We also hosted him at Casa Ramirez. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then, of course, I'm proud to serve as the literary curator for the Latino Bookstore at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. And I'm so glad that we formed part of his legacy by teaming up with Aztlan Libre Press, and we'll talk to Juan in a little bit. And we all teamed up for the national launch of his, what would come to be his last book, and we'll talk about that as well. The last thing I'll say, I'm blessed. We would talk by phone, shoot the breeze. We smuggled his books across the Southwest because he was part of the outlawed curriculum in the Mexican American Studies program, and that brilliant curriculum that should have been extolled instead of banned by right-wing legislators in Arizona. He was on that list. He was visiting the schools. I suspect if someone needs a project, they still have some of his books in warehouses there in Tucson. We may have to look into that. And finally, I was talking to him online, and he invited me to be part of this new series of events he did there in the homeland at Teotihuacan. And that meant so much to me, especially as on the cover of my book, The Tip of the Pyramid, Cultivating Community Cultural Capital, I'm sitting on Teotihuacan. And he reached out to me right away to say, let's work together. I don't want to take too much time, but I do want you to know how much we're hurting, but at the same time, how much we loved him, how much he changed our lives, and how much he gave back. We have just a few friends who can want to talk a little bit more about that. There's so many others that we won't be able to speak. I'm so happy that we could be joined by our dear friend, Matt Cedillo. Un abrazo grande, brother. Thank you for joining us, especially on short notice. And then also Juan Tejeda, who is also representing Anissa Onofore, who is also the co-founders of Aztlan Libre Press, who published the last book. Juan, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll also have Rodrigo Bravo, who is our sound engineer, who'll talk also about the impact of Roberto's work on him. Juan, let's start with you. There've been a lot of different tributes, but I am so thank you for putting time and energy, capital, love, blood, sweat, and tears into publishing what would be the final book of Dr. Cintli.
Well, thank you, Tony. I'm glad to be here on behalf of my wife Anissa Nofre and Aslan Libre Press. This is uh, what ended up being Cintli's last book that he published before he passed away on July 31st, which is just a couple of weeks ago. This was writing 50 years, más o menos, amongst the Gringos. It's an almost 50-year curated compilation of his work um, that includes 91 columns, poems, articles that he did in journalistic writings, some academic work, some things that had never been published before, excerpts from his previous 7 books. So we included these 91 articles from 36 different publications that he had originally published them in, from the 1970s all the way through 2010. So we're very proud of this book. It won the 2022 International Latino Book Award in the Raúl Izaguirre Best Political / Current Affairs Book category last year. So the gold medal in that category. It's designed for Mexican American, Chicano, and ethnic studies classes for college, university students, and even high school students in Chicano history, Chicano studies, Mexican American studies, and journalism communications courses. So at the end of each decade, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010, we had 3 educators, Lupe Carrasco Cardona and Jenny Luna from California, and Dr. Liliana Patricia Saldaña from UTSA here in San Antonio, that worked up questions for discussion, writing prompts, and activities for students and teachers. So I think it's an important document. And I had mentioned before that I think that it was Dr. Cintli's book, this book that we published, that solidified in my mind the importance of our publications and all publications for La Raza, and I think primarily with independent presses, but also other university-based presses and even the majors, the importance of our publications as our modern-day códices. These are the things that we're leaving behind for our children and all future generations for them to learn from. So we're very proud of this publication.
I also want to add that speaking of the importance of the codices, speaking of the importance of this work, I also want to let people know that the Latino Bookstore at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center in San Antonio will continue to have his book in stock so that others can continue to read his work and pass it on, and perhaps donate copies to schools, to colleges, to universities, and remembering that these words were banned by the state of Arizona, we should remember to continue to build our family libraries, our public libraries, and our underground libraries. And you've done a lot of that. We're going to come back and talk about the book a little more. And thank you for all that you're doing at San Libre Press. I do want to give a shout out to our friend Matt Cedillo representing Califas. You've done some tributes for him. Shout out to Gustavo Arellano, also speaking of California, that wrote a piece for him in the LA Times. There's been others as well. Matt, you did a tribute for him as well. You want to tell us a little bit about his impact on you?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Tony, and thank you for doing this. Actually, in addition to there's so many different, like strands that tie me to Roberto. I reviewed his book Yolki, Republican Intellectuals, and he actually reviewed Mowing Leaves of Grass as well for the same publication. So I had this original idea that we'd have one article and it'd be like a joint review of each other's books, but they ended up splitting them up. But yeah, no, I mean, it was incredible. I mean, I'd known him, but to actually read the book and see that it was such an incredible, you know, honor that he wanted me to do that. But it was also such an incredible read. I mean, to see you know, all this history of our people really come to life. I mean, obviously, every time you're kind of confronted with that, it's really quite an enriching and enraging and just a really just fulfilling experience. But to see him just as a writer, the way that he would play with time and the way he would play with major events. So one moment you would be like in Whittier Boulevard, the next minute it's you know, Cortez is showing up in Tenochtitlan. Another minute it's way before that. It's like the dawn of corn. It's like the beginning of time. It's the beginning of our people. That he would never ever teach a history that began with the conquest. It was always, you know, the time before that. It's return to the corn. I mean, his name was Cintli. So there was so much about him. That was incredible. But one of the most incredible things, just as a writer, was how he played with time. You know, people talk about these days about, you know, creating, you know, futurism, and they you know, put like, you know, Afrofuturism or even Chicano futurism. They'll put like a hyphenated kind of futurism about it, but he played with time in a different kind of way, where it was the past, the present, and the future all at once. And in many ways, it wasn't like this new trend. It was a way of that we had perceived time before, you know, colonization, before the imposition of this way of looking at the world. And so I think that he really tapped into that. And I think that he was really a great, you know, he really greatly expressed that greatly. But he wasn't just like some type of spiritual guru or some type of guy that was just about returning to the corn. He was very much at his feet in the real world. He would talk about, you know, police shootings. He would talk about our education system. He would talk about all these things where we were being either underrepresented, or things were underfunded, or we were being overly policed, whatever it might be, with these really tangible day-to-day issues. But he would also put them against the backdrop of big history and about, you know, of who we are as a people and what is denied to us. So he was an incredible author, an incredible, you know, just incredible member of the community. And I feel it's lost very greatly. But I'm very honored that there was so many different things that tied to him, whether it be through Are, and we were talking about earlier about Lupe, and then, you know, they were coordinating a trip for Are to go down to Teotihuacan to the embassy. I was also tied to him through his projects with the police report, with the police murders that he was reporting on. There was an artistic project headed by Aztlan Underground that I was a part of that album. Me and him and, like, I guess Armando Duran, we were kind of, I had kind of gotten, they had a project where they were going to take Armando's art collection over to Teotihuacan. And so I kind of got involved in the conversation about how to extend that to some of my contacts in Mexico City. And so, you know, I was tied to him in a million ways. It just shows just how active he really was, you know, because everywhere I turned, there was Cintli. Everywhere I turned, there was the corn. So he was a great man.
Thank you for sharing that and putting into perspective what a high bar he set for activism and also the academic field, so that he shattered that ivory tower and created all these bridges. And we'll get back to more of that. Rodrigo, you know, Matt mentioned the book Yolki. We did host Dr. Cintli at Casa Ramirez here in Houston about that book too, and you mentioned it touched you as well. If you'd be kind of to share some of that.
Yeah, I mean, Matt said it perfectly. You know, it's like a spiritual awakening to hear something so profound, so deep, and it just touches you. When I read that book, and I have been a fan of Dr. Cintli's work before, but when he wrote Yolki, to me, it just spoke to me about finding those roots and being connected. And it was really beautiful because even this past weekend, Tony, you featured Octavio Quintanilla and Jennifer Alanis here in San Antonio for their reading. And Jen mentioned how she had to, at one point, really look back and summon that female warrior that spirit of the Mayan princess. And it really just kind of brought it full circle. And I said, oh my God, that's what Dr. Cintli was talking about. That if we don't know our roots, that we don't go back to them, that we're going to be lost. That we've already lost so much, right? And in Yolki, when I read that book, it really touched my heart because Dr. Cintli really spoke on so many people. And here's the beauty of it. It doesn't just pertain to Chicano, Chicanx, Chicanismo. It does. It's a heavy part of it, but it really pertains to all marginalized people as to the spiritual violence that they have felt, that they have, that we constantly have to endure. If you don't mind, I just want to read a quick quote from that book. When he says, really quickly from Dr. Cintli's book, Yolki, and he's talking about spiritual violence. And he says, I am saying that people of color suffer from something much more profound, spiritual violence. It is repressive and it is totalizing. I would even venture to say that people of color have been subjected to what can aptly be called spiritual and cultural genocide. Yet spiritual death, even mass spiritual death, is not the worst thing that can happen to a people. To have our spirits battered daily, especially when such battering is directed by the state and all its institutions, is a worse violation because it is to die a daily death. And with everything that's going on, Tony, and how we keep continually see marginalized folks, beaten down, taking our history away. Yes, maybe kids don't get beat up for speaking Spanish at school. Great. That doesn't happen anymore. But guess what? They're taking away our books. Okay. They're preventing us from learning our own history. They're actually banning books again. And so that's why Dr. Cintli's work, the work that Matt Cedillo is doing, the work that Aslan Libre Press is doing with Juan there, everybody, we're all inspired by Dr. Cintli because he fought that fight. He fought that fight, and he made sure that people knew, hey, you know what? We're here. We're going to make our histories known, and we're going to let people know what it's all about. And I'll say this last piece very briefly. The beautiful thing about Dr. Cintli was he welcomed everybody. I always felt humbled. I always felt honored. Like he didn't matter to anybody. He welcomed everybody as long as you understood, hey, we're in this fight together. If you're not in the fight with me, though, hey, he didn't have time for that. So, I really did appreciate Dr. Cintli, and I appreciated you, Tony, for bringing him on the show because it gave me a totally brand new perspective as to the work that needs to be done out here in Tejas, San Antonio, in the United States.
Yeah, and I think you're also touching on his wisdom. He was very proud to be Chicano, but at the same time, he didn't let identity terms separate others who were not from our backgrounds to feel like they weren't part of this universal struggle. So that's a great point. You know what, Rodrigo? I want to thank you too I want to thank you and Roxana for always producing our shows with so much genius. You're so generous with your genius. Do me a favor. You want to tell folks how you designed today's show so that they can know what's coming up next, but they can also know that you wanted to make a statement about his work with this show.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we honor all of our folks when they're here and they're doing the work, and obviously honor them when they go to the other side, if you will. It's difficult, but we have to be reminded of what the legacy means, what honoring means. And so we did have Dr. Cintli on the show several times. His last interview was when you were introducing the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center Latino Bookstore. And he was one of the authors there. And Juan Tejeda published with Aslan Libre Press, published his last book. And it just seems fitting, I hate to say it that way. I don't mean to sound, without tact, but it just seems fitting that our last interaction with Dr. Cintli here was him still fighting, luchando, to make sure that the west side of San Antonio had a renowned author come through, talk about the book, and have a repository, the Latino Bookstore there. So we will be featuring his interview that the last interview that he had with you, talking about his book and talking about the impact of the Latino Bookstore.
And I'd like to touch bases for 2 minutes to part and reflect on legacy with Juan and Matt, and we'll start with Juan. But Juan, think about that legacy. Here we are talking about 50 years of writing. Here we're talking about Asan Libre Press. Here we're talking about a Latino bookstore, one of the only ones in Tejas, on the poorest zip code in Tejas, on the west side of San Antonio, a national launch for a wonderful event. Oye, me toca el corazón recordar en ese momento. Fue lindísimo. That was beautiful. That's what this is all about. And I just want to say that because, Rodrigo, you're not being tacked less. I think we need to understand everything that all of us are doing and just lean in more. Juan, you want to close us out with a little about the legacy of Dr. Cintli and your work and the connections?
Well, Dr. Cintli was so prolific, over 50 years of writing since the 1970s when he was at UCLA as a student. And he began writing as a journalist, as a college student, working with La Gente de Aztlán newspaper. And in fact, writing about Chicano studies, writing about the different issues and problems that existed in our community, the sexism amongst our razas. I remember we include that article in here where he wrote an editorial in support of Dr. Ana Nieto Gomez, who was losing her tenured position there in California at one of the universities. But over the span of 50 years, I mentioned earlier that he said he had over 2,000 articles and pieces of writings that he narrowed down to this curated collection that we put out in 2021. But he wrote about violence. He was almost killed in 1979 there in East Los Angeles, East LA, when he was covering for Lowrider magazine, the opening of Boulevard Nights, that movie, and he photographed some deputy sheriffs there in East LA beating up a young Chicanito. And they saw him photographing this and they went after him. And he threw his camera away trying to preserve it to a friend, but they ended up beating him. He almost ended up dying. So throughout his life, he was very involved in trying to bring to light the tremendous police brutality and police and state violence that we as indigenous Mexican Chicano people have had to endure, just like the African Americans, right? Although sometimes the indigenous Chicano killings at the hand of law enforcement, doesn't get the attention or publicity that maybe the African Americans or other groups get. But very involved throughout his life about writing about police brutality and state violence against the indigenous Mexican people, writing about Mexican American studies when they banned the program, a very successful program. And, that's where you had your Librotraficante movement there in Arizona and Tucson in the high school, probably the most successful, Mexican American studies program that existed in our history at the high school level. The students were excelling, and yet the state government there bans the program and started banning books and other information that were a part of these classes. He was writing about all kinds of issues throughout his career with, like I said, very, very different publications. There were 36 publications that we included here, from the LA Times to the Washington Post, to more recently, when he continued writing up until the day he died. He was writing a monthly column for, The Populist. And he had these online academic and popular intellectual forums, really, and he was always doing that. So his legacy are obviously all of the writings he's left behind, 8 books, starting with his very first one, which was Assault with a Deadly Weapon in 1984, that chronicled his beatings and the aftermath. Justice, A Question of Race, The X en la Raza, which was very important, very formative for our people. He wrote that article, Who Declared War on the Word Chicano? which was very important. He included then in the Ex en la Raza, the Codex Tamuanchan on becoming human, Amoxli, the Ex Codis, our sacred Maiz is our mother, indigeneity and belonging in the Americas, Yolki, a warrior summoned from the spirit world, Testimonios on Violence, and then finally this last one, the last book he wrote, Writing 50 Years, Más o Menos Amongst the Gringos. So all of these tremendous writings, the books, but he produced, films. He was constantly touring, giving talks. Besides teaching, he was a Mexican-American and Raza Studies professor at the University of Arizona. He received his PhD, and with his book on the sacred Maiz is our mother. He ended up, sort of moving beyond this sort of Chicanismo identity without ever losing it, but moving to what he liked to say, that he was referred to himself as a gente de maíz, right? Not only are we made of maíz, we are maíz, we eat maíz, we are made of maíz, and moving into this, I think, cosmic understanding of how we're all related as human beings, becoming human, but related to the whole cosmos. So he had this cosmic understanding, and he dealt a lot with healing because he experienced the violence. And I think that is very much a part of his legacy, is that he talked about the importance of healing our people from this trauma that we've experienced over generations, over 500 years. And he really, more than anybody else, connected the violence that he experienced and our people experienced here on this continent, on both continents, to the violence that was perpetrated upon us as indigenous people over 500 years ago, and how that's tied all the way to the beginning. So it's a big loss for our community, but he has left us a lot of his books and his writings and his teachings and his wisdom. And a friend of mine, Jesse Mancia, said, people like Cintli will never die. He is written into our history books. He's written our history books too. And I firmly agree with him. And he's left a tremendous legacy for all future generations.
Thank you for those words. Also, I should mention, you mentioned talking about feminism. We've got all guys on here, except Lupe came through for us. Thank you very
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here.
We are talking about the legacy of Dr. Cintli and his impact on us and our community. Would you like to offer some reflections?
Absolutely. Thank you. It's such an honor to be able to be here with you all to talk about our great friend and elder and teacher. It's just this beautiful human being. I think today is probably the first day that I would be able to actually speak like this. It has been such a, like Juan was saying, a tremendous loss. My heart has been heavy. The world has been a different place since I got the news about him. So I'll kind of share a little bit about what he means to me and to a lot of the people I know. I'm a Chicana. I'm a Chicano studies teacher, and I'm also an ethnic studies teacher. I'm an organizer in the community. And I come from a family who has spent my whole life part of the re-indigenization, right? Our colonization over the past 500 years has de-indigenized, detribalized a lot of us. And because of that relationship that I have in my family with that, my family is, they're ceremonia people, they're ceremony people. They're also, teachers. My father was a sun dancer, and other ways that he participated in ceremonia. And so when I first became a teacher, I just started my 24th school year. So my very first classroom, my father handed me the X and La Raza too.
Wow.
Right. And my father, he was like, you must use this book. I was a social studies teacher at the time, but I would infuse, to be culturally responsive to my students, I would infuse what my students were lacking, that was to help them understand who they were, where they come from. So I helped them, as in the way that Cintli would say, follow the maíz back then, using a lot of his work. And at that time, I started to follow the X column that he and Patricia were prolific in teaching the community with, right? And so Cintli, he was he was one of those who really helped shape me as an educator. When I first came into the classroom, I had this like very, colonial idea of the teacher is supposed to be this certain thing. And this is how we conduct, teaching with students. Even though I was going into the classroom very much as a social justice educator, as a Chicana, as someone who had been a part of the movement with my father, I was coming to the classroom with that. But my pedagogy was still very colonial. And it was through Cintli and through others, but definitely this beautiful, wonderful human being, that I learned the importance of being real and authentic with who I am, in order for my students to authentically be reconnected to who they were. And he helped me to understand that. And I will be forever grateful, right? Another thing that he helped me pedagogically to understand was that it's not just like me as this, quote unquote, educated, knowledgeable person in the classroom, right? It's about our community, right? It's about being out there with the community. And I think that's something that we have lost in our, I can speak for like Chicano studies. I don't mean lost like completely, but I think that it isn't as strong as it should be, that we should be having our parents come in as educators as well. Right, because they are educators as well, and just making it a little bit more of something strong that we reconnect, and bringing in our elders as experts, right? Like how we would bring in Cintli, he would always be, he gladly would come into our classrooms, he would come to our grassroots organizations and speak, and so he really taught me that importance. And I really want to say that the way we can keep him alive, aside from the beautiful immortal writings that he's kept for us, his thoughts and all those countless books and films that he's produced, is that learning, is that we need to make sure that that we help our students follow the maíz, right? And then help them also to understand that the importance of keeping that alive for the next generations, right? Because we have a lot of trauma, right? And that trauma, we're reproducing it, that horizontal violence, we're reproducing it in our communities. And he has shown us that when we reconnect with it, we heal, right? And then when we facilitate that for the next generations in whatever way, because all of us have our own special gifts, right? My superpower is I'm a teacher, right? Cintli was a professor and also a beautiful writer, right? We have our muralists, we have our musicians, we have all of our people, we have our journalists, right? We have our broadcast people. All of us in our special way, we need to keep that going, that reconnection, and not just like, I'm here to reconnect you, but the pedagogical element, right? Like showing them how that has helped us, and giving those keys to the next generations for them to be able to do so as well, and whatever it is that their gifts are. I have to say that I feel extremely blessed to have learned that from Cintli, not just through his writings, but through my friendship with him. This is a tremendous loss, but I absolutely believe that he will live forever. Will live beyond us. We're blessed that we got to personally know him. But yeah, I really love how he began in the pueblo Aguascalientes. He came here to the barrio, right? And then he reconnected with the pueblo, and with the Aslan Nawak cultural embassy that he was helping create, he was helping. It was beautiful because he wasn't just bringing us there to reconnect, but he was also facilitating our people over there, our relatives over there, reconnecting with us. Right, because not only did we kind of lose a little bit of our connection when we come here into the system, but they lost us too, right? And so the intercambio, coming together, that's another beautiful pedagogical model, right? It's not just about us going and taking; it's also about us giving, because we have an experience as Chicano people here in the U.S. We have an experience where our antepasados have experienced colonialism, and then we have this extra layer of what we've experienced as a people here, that we're still experiencing as a people here. And it was very beautiful. Like, we were there in the like one of the associations, Association of Raza Educators. I'm the chair of the Los Angeles chapter. So we went there for the when they did the big opening last year. And that was one of the big learnings that we got, was we're gonna also share our experiences. And it was beautiful to see and hear and learn about our relatives over there who have the same sort of reconnections, re-indigenizing, re-tribalizing, not just knowing that we're from here, but also like being bold enough to declare it, right? To declare it. We are not like foreigners, right? And being very bold to learn about it, to be it, and to share that love and pride with our next generations, right? Whether it's our community, whether it's our familias, or whether, like in our case, our students, or in some of your cases with all your readers, all the people who read or listen to your broadcasts. That's powerful. And that's another way I think we need to keep Cintli alive, is through that. We need to keep him alive, his actual direct teachings, but also those pedagogical elements of reconnecting. Yeah.
That's beautiful. That's powerful. And thank you so much for adding that perspective. It's amazing how each of us had such different and profound experiences with their Cintli. I want to thank Dr. Lupe Carrasco Cardona for sharing that with us. And I do want to also give a shout out to the Institute of Chicano Psychology and Community Wellness in Austin. They were also there at the launch of Dr. Cintli's book at the Latino Bookstore. Matt, we mentioned we're going to give you the last 2 minutes. Matt, anything you'd like to add about the legacy to round this out?
Well, I would just like to reiterate what I had said earlier, that the real brilliance of Cintli as not as a writer, but also as a human being, was his relationship with time, and that time would move forward, it would be backwards, and we would be in one place, then we'd be in another, and it was all seamless. It was a very seamless transition. So there's so many writers today who move between being an artist and being like an academic, and then being like a thinker, and then being like a poet, and then being also this, and so much of Cintli is felt in that. I mean, a lot of what Tim Hernandez does these days. I mean, a lot of this kind of movement that just kind of goes from this to that, the other. It's really difficult to imagine without the huge legacy of Roberto Rodríguez, who was so many things to so many people, and so very, very skilled in so many different crafts. But he presented it not as like these individual talents, but as like this kind of seamless thing, just a human expression. And so he's one of our great writers, and one of our greats. So I'm moved to have known him, and whatever legacy he had. I mean, the thing about Cintli is that his work was about the people, but also the way he worked was with the people. So much he did what he did in collective, and so much he did in a very spiritual way is going to live on forever. But also so much of what he did in a very practical way, the work will continue. The work will continue with the embassy. The work will continue with the police brutality reports. The work will continue with this larger project of returning people to their ancestral roots. That work will continue. And I know this not just in a general, beautiful way, but in a very, very practical, everyday way. And that was really what Cintli was someone who bridged this vision of who we truly are with every day, get your hands dirty, get to work kind of thing, and the work will continue. So that's what I have to say.
No, thank you. And we, on behalf of our team from Tejas, we're going to renew our commitment to our brothers and sisters in Califas throughout the Southwest to keep, like you said, Lupe, that's part of the pedagogy. Break these barriers. Please, están en casa. Keep us posted. We want to help con nuestro granito de arena, also with the Latino Bookstore in San Antonio. And let's all remember, the legacy is on at this moment. It continues. The work continues. I do want to thank Rodrigo Bravo for producing our radio shows. And I also want to thank Roxana Guzman for helping produce our multi-platform broadcasts. I want to thank Leona Lopez, our coordinator, our graphic designer, Mark Anthony Pignon, Brian Paras, who helped us with environmental justice, Lupe Mendez, who helped us with our community engagement, Laura Torres, who helps us a lot with the pedagogy and reaching out to different institutions. And I want folks to know that this is going to air on 90.1 FM KPFT, Houston's community station, at 100,000 watts on free radio. And if you tune into the radio broadcast of this show, you will then hear an excerpt from the interview that we had with Dr. Cintli. It was one of our last interviews with him. But kind of like Matt was saying, we're changing time, because when I hear his voice, I get animado otra vez. I join all of you. I'm able to talk about this a little differently this week when I convene with all of you, with that fuerza y ánimo, and I remember all the work that they did. So I want to thank everybody for their support for this radio show, and our granito de arena for this entire movement, and to all of you for all that you do for all of us to keep us moving forward. And again, this show is in honor of Dr. Cintli, who changed the world with his work and continues to live through the power of words and cultura. Thank you. Stay tuned for more of his words. This is Tony Diaz, Librotraficante. Gracias.